My name is Rachel Bennett. I am 29 years old and I live in Denver, Colorado. I am an ICU nurse.
For 6 years, I've worked night shifts, holding the hands of strangers in the worst moments of their lives, keeping people alive when their own families couldn't be there. I used to think that was enough. I used to think that saving lives for a living meant something to the people who mattered most to me. I was wrong. 3 months ago, at my in-laws' dinner table, my father-in-law looked me straight in the eyes, in front of my husband, my mother-in-law, and half the extended family, and said the words that changed everything. "Nurses," he said, swirling the wine in his glass like I wasn't even worth looking at directly, "are just doctors who couldn't make the cut." Everyone laughed. Even my husband gave a small, awkward smile. I smiled too. I didn't say a word. But I had no idea that in less than 8 weeks, that same man would be lying in a hospital bed, and the only person standing between him and the end of his life would be me. Let me take you back further, because to understand how much that dinner hurt me, you need to understand what I gave up to get there. I married my husband, Daniel, 4 years ago. He was kind, steady, the kind of man who remembered how you took your coffee after the first date. His parents, Richard and Linda, welcomed me in a way that felt real, at least at first. Richard was a retired hospital administrator, a man who had spent 30 years around doctors, around white coats and framed diplomas, around people who, in his mind, actually mattered. I loved my job. I still do. There's nothing quite like the moment a patient opens their eyes after you've spent 6 hours fighting to keep them breathing. I used to come home from 12-hour shifts exhausted, but proud. I used to tell Daniel stories about my patients, about the little girl who survived a car accident, about the grandfather who held my hand and thanked me before he passed peacefully with his family around him. For the first year, Richard seemed to respect that. He'd ask polite questions at dinner. He'd nod along. That's when everything changed. Slowly, quietly, in ways I almost didn't notice. It started small. A comment here, a joke there. "So, when are you going back to school? Nursing's a good stepping stone," Richard said once, like my career was a waiting room I hadn't left yet. I laughed it off. Daniel told me not to take it personally. "That's just how my dad talks," he said. Then it got worse. At a family barbecue, Richard introduced me to his old colleagues as Daniel's wife, she's in healthcare, never once saying the word nurse, as if it were something to be softened, hidden, smoothed over. I wish I noticed the signs earlier. I wish I had understood that his comments weren't clumsy jokes. They were a pattern, a quiet campaign to make me feel small in front of the people I loved. But I stayed quiet. I told myself it didn't matter what Richard thought. I told myself Daniel's love was enough. The real betrayal wasn't just the words. It was what I found out later. A colleague of mine, Priya, worked at the same hospital network as Richard's old contacts. One afternoon, she pulled me aside in the break room, her face tight with hesitation. "Rachel," she said, "I need to tell you something, and I don't think you're going to like it." She told me that Richard had been quietly reaching out to people on the hospital board, people who remembered him from his administrator days, suggesting that I was unreliable, that I had attitude problems, that maybe I wasn't cut out for critical care. My stomach dropped. He wasn't just insulting my job at dinner. He was trying to end my career behind my back. I sat there in that break room, holding a cold cup of coffee, trying to process the fact that the man who called himself family had been working, quietly, deliberately, to take away the one thing that made me feel proud of myself. That night, I sat in my car outside our apartment for almost an hour before I could bring myself to go inside. I kept replaying every dinner, every backhanded comment, every time I had smiled through the humiliation because I didn't want to cause problems in the family. I felt stupid. I felt small. I felt like 6 years of sacrifice. The missed holidays, the sleepless nights, the tears I'd cried over patients I couldn't save, meant nothing to the man whose approval I had quietly been chasing. When I finally told Daniel what Priya had said, he went pale. "That can't be true," he said, but I could see it in his eyes. Some part of him already believed it. He knew his father. He just hadn't wanted to admit what his father was capable of. I didn't cry in front of him. I saved that for later, alone in the bathroom, staring at my reflection and asking myself the same question over and over. How do you fight someone who smiles at you with one hand while trying to destroy you with the other? I didn't have an answer yet, but I knew one thing. I wasn't going to stay silent anymore. I decided to do something Richard never expected. I stopped reacting with anger, and I started paying attention. Over the next few weeks, I quietly gathered everything. Priya helped me get copies of the emails Richard had sent, emails where he used his old title to make his complaints about me sound official, credible, dangerous to my career. I kept records, I kept dates, I stayed calm, and I stayed silent, because I understood something Richard didn't. The truth doesn't need to be loud, it just needs to be documented. What happened next still shocks me, even now. Because while I was quietly building my case, fate was building something else entirely, something none of us saw coming. I want to be honest with you. I didn't plan what happened next. Nobody could have planned it. But I did make one decision, and it was this. The next time Richard tried to make me feel small, I wasn't going to smile and stay quiet. I was going to let the truth speak for itself at the moment it mattered most. I kept the emails. I kept Priya's statement. I even scheduled a meeting with the hospital's HR department, ready to lay out exactly what Richard had done and why it mattered. Not just for me, but for every nurse he might try to undermine in the future. I wasn't looking for revenge. I was looking for justice. The kind that comes from finally being seen for who you really are, instead of who someone else insists you must be. I had no idea that justice was about to arrive in a way far more dramatic than any meeting could have delivered. It was a Tuesday night, close to midnight, when my phone rang. It was the hospital. Richard had collapsed at home. Chest pain, difficulty breathing, a suspected heart attack. He was being rushed to my hospital, the exact ICU where I worked. My hands were shaking as I got the call to come in early for my shift. Daniel was already racing to the hospital, and I remember standing in my kitchen, staring at my scrubs, thinking about every insult, every quiet campaign against my career, every moment Richard had made me feel like I wasn't good enough to sit at his table, and now his life might depend on someone exactly like me. I could have asked to be reassigned. Some nurses would have, but I didn't, because somewhere underneath all the hurt, I still believed in what I did for a living, even for a man who had tried to take it away from me. When I walked into that ICU room and saw Richard lying there, pale, connected to monitors, gasping for breath, I felt something unexpected. Not satisfaction, not anger, just a strange, quiet clarity. I was his nurse now, not Daniel's wife, not healthcare or whatever. His nurse, the person whose training, whose calm hands, whose 6 years of experience were the only thing standing between him and the worst outcome imaginable. I did my job. I did it exactly the way I do it for every patient, with focus, with care, with everything I had. When Richard stabilized hours later and opened his eyes to see me adjusting his IV line, I watched the realization hit him like a wave. This woman he had dismissed at dinner, this career he had called a stepping stone, this was the person who had just kept him alive. Linda came in the next morning, and when she asked the attending doctor who had been on Richard's case overnight, the answer stopped her cold. Rachel, the doctor said, she's the reason his numbers stabilized as fast as they did. I didn't say a single word about the emails, the hospital board, the months of quiet sabotage. I didn't need to. The truth exposed itself in the most undeniable way possible. The days that followed were quiet, but everything had shifted. Richard couldn't look me in the eye anymore, not out of embarrassment for being sick, but out of something deeper. Shame. Real shame, the kind that comes when you realize the person you tried to diminish is the reason you're still breathing. Eventually, my HR meeting still happened. I laid out everything, calmly, professionally, without a hint of the anger I had every right to feel. The hospital board took it seriously. Richard's old contacts distanced themselves from him. His attempt to end my career had, instead, ended his influence in that hospital system for good. Daniel apologized to me the night Richard was discharged, not for his father's actions, those weren't his to apologize for, but for the times he had stayed silent when he should have spoken up for me. I should have defended you sooner, he said. You should have, I told him. But you're doing it now. That's what matters. Richard sent me a card a few weeks later. It wasn't long. It just said, "Thank you for saving my life. I'm sorry it took this for me to see you clearly." I keep it in a drawer at home, not because I've forgotten what he did, but because it reminds me of something important. That respect you have to demand from someone is never really respect at all. Real respect comes when someone finally sees the truth, whether they wanted to or not. I still work nights. I still hold strangers' hands in the worst moments of their lives. and I've stopped needing anyone's approval to know that what I do matters. If there's one thing I've learned from all of this, it's this. You don't have to prove your worth to people who've already decided not to see it. Sometimes, life proves it for you, in the last place you'd ever expect. My name is Rachel Bennett. I'm an ICU nurse, and I will never again apologize for the work that saves lives.